Tonight we're in Hastings, and welcome to Question Time. On our panel tonight, one of the three Brexiteers, the Conservative International Trade Secretary Liam Fox, Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, who today forced the government to agree free abortions in Britain for women from Northern Ireland, the Editor-in-Chief of The Economist, Zanny Minton-Beddoes, the founder and editor of the left-wing news website The Canary, Kerry-Ann Mendoza, and the LBC radio host who teaches politicians to count, Nick Ferrari. Now, thank you very much. Remember, at home watching this, if you want to get into the debate, Twitter, Facebook, our hashtag BBCQT, our text number, if you want to text us, 83981. Our first question from Marianne Smith, please.
Is it right that 10 DUP votes have been bought by the government when Mrs May told a nurse that there was no magic money tree?
So, she actually said that here on Question Time to a nurse when she was on the programme just before the election. There isn't a magic money tree that we can shake that suddenly provides for everything people want. Liam Fox.
Well, the government after the election had no overall majority. We had a duty to form a government. That's what's required by our constitution, and that's what we've done. The DUP share a lot of common elements with the Conservative Party on things like the union, believing in the union of the United Kingdom. They supported our Brexit deal. They support the proposals we have of dealing with extremism. They're very important elements going forward.
It's the £1 billion she's
I understand
asking
that.
about. Can you
be
turn
patient,
to the £1 billion?
And what, of course, it's the MPs from the DUP clearly wanted to get better funding for Northern Ireland and things like infrastructure, and who can blame them? They've got an influence that they didn't have before, and that's what our political system throws up. But there is something that was different about Northern Ireland. If you look at the city deals that were done in England, there were over nearly £3.2 billion worth of city deals done. In Scotland, there was £750 million of city deals done. In Wales, £500 million. In Northern Ireland, zero. They weren't getting any of the benefit of that programme that the government had brought forward. And the money,
so
of course,
just kind of catching up.
Does it mean that then, in order for Northern Ireland to get the funding it deserves, Theresa May has to depend on them to stay in power?
No, but the funding that has been allocated is for a number of specific projects. Mental health is one of them, clearly. The facilities in Northern Ireland should be better, but also Northern Ireland's infrastructure in terms of its economy has a number of deficiencies. And Northern Ireland, in terms of exports, is the lowest exporting part of the United Kingdom.
So where's the money going to come from?
Well, the money
we were told only 2 weeks ago there wasn't any.
The money will have to come from the Treasury, and it will have to come from within the existing programmes that we have. But
so there is a money tree, you just shake it a bit and it drops.
But we do have programmes that need to be funded. Remember, this money does not go to the DUP. This money goes to the government of Northern Ireland itself.
But it's money that is found when you needed to find a way to do this deal. It's not money that was sort of sitting there that's, nobody had thought of for anything else. There are lots of places in this country that could do with a bit more infrastructure. There are lots of places that could do with it. But I think I'm interested in how you started this answer. You said that the government had a duty to form a government. Well, actually, it didn't have a duty to do a grubby deal. It had, it could perfectly well have functioned as a minority government. We've had minority governments before. They tend to be quite weak ones. But it's not at all clear to me that this deal, which not only is, frankly, a grubby bribe of £1 billion, it also makes the whole peace process somewhat harder. I would say that it makes Brexit more complicated. In this case, to paraphrase someone, no deal might have been better than a bad deal.
Okay. Nick Ferrari.
The question was it right? And it was right and it was wrong. It was wrong because it was shabby, but it's what politicians sometimes do, and politicians of all colours. We can look in the past at Labour, how they, when they were in power, they channeled vast sums of money to northern cities such as Manchester and Leeds and Sheffield, where they have their core vote. So in a way, it's the same sort of thing. It's equally shabby. It shouldn't have been done. It shouldn't have been done, but it was done. Because they're staying to their core vote.
How can you possibly equate investing in the regeneration of much-needed regeneration of towns and cities across the land with a grubby little deal that Theresa May made simply to retain power? I mean, that's absurd.
All right. But where I believe it was a good thing, that given what we've seen as utterances from Jeremy Corbyn and from the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell over the past week or so, I view the prospect of having Jeremy Corbyn as our Prime Minister as I would for going for a Sunday drive with Richard Hammond. So I'm rather pleased that they've done the deal, because it keeps the two of them back.
All right, Stella Creasy.
Look, we can talk about the mechanics of what's happening in Parliament and the fact that it basically equates to every single DUP MP being worth £1 million. But actually what matters here is this country hasn't had a pay rise for 10 years. People, I see it in my surgery, I see it in my constituency every single day, people for whom there is far too much month left at the end of their money, and they are desperate. And I'm talking to schools where teachers are quitting in droves. My local hospital has a nurses shortage. Our public sector workers, those firemen, those policemen who've kept us safe, who ran into burning buildings. And yesterday, some of them might have turned on the news halfway through the day and thought, finally, somebody is listening. So what a cruel, horrible moment it was when the government voted down our attempt to say, you know what, actually there is agreement across this House that these people deserve a pay rise. Let's do something about it.
OK. Yeah, I'll come to that. Carry on.
I've said, to come back to Marianne's question, we all watched that nurse plead with Theresa May, plead with her that she hadn't had a pay rise for 10 years and she needed a break. And the Prime Minister looked her square in the eye and said there was no magic money tree. And then when the British public refused to give Theresa May a majority, she bought one for £1.5 billion. And as Stella says, what was the first thing she did with that majority that she bought with £1.5 billion of your money? She said to that nurse, she said to the police that ran into the Manchester concert bombing and the terrorist attacks on London, and she said to the firefighters that ran up 20 stories in Grenfell Tower to save lives, you're not worth a pay rise. It's outrageous.
You sir up there, and I'll come to you, Liam, obviously. Your man up there. Yes?
I can't believe that Liam Fox mentioned security in connection with the DUP. The Tory party trying to smear Corbyn with his connection with attempting to create a peace deal in Northern Ireland. That is shameful.
You in the front. The man in the front here, second row, yes, you.
I think it's quite incredible, especially from Labour, that they're not recognising that, as Nigel Dodd said, Labour tried to do a deal in both 2015 and 2010, and also the SNP even tried to do a deal UP. So I feel it's a bit of hypocrisy coming from everybody, actually.
Okay. Liam Fox, do you want to come back on the money point?
Yeah. Well, it is very clear. That's a very, very good point. It's a point I was going to make. Stella didn't actually mention about the coalition, about the deal of confidence supply that we have. It's not a coalition.
Liam, do you think I would have voted to go into coalition with the people I've just been fighting about abortion rights with?
You tried to go into coalition with them in 2010. Gordon Brown tried to stay in power by doing a deal with the DUP in 2010. So let's have none of this high-minded stuff. That's exactly what you tried to do.
Yes. Can I just ask you, because one question is, did you really need to do this? Was it a necessary deal? Because it seems to me hard to believe that the DUP, when push came to shove, would vote against you if it meant that Jeremy Corbyn would be in power, given his relationship with Sinn Féin. I think you have a sort of a view that you're very good negotiators. You know, you're the best crack negotiating team. It strikes me that in this area, at least, it was a pretty poorly done negotiation.
OK, are you in the check?
Yeah, Mr. Fox, you can't explain that the deal with the DUP is to improve infrastructure. This is really just a ploy to get into power.
OK, I'm going to take... we're talking, touch briefly on the nurse. Let's just deal with that for a moment. David Bryant, let's have your question, please. David Bryant.
Should MPs receive a wage freeze and cap on expenses in this time of austerity?
Should MPs receive a wage freeze? And I think, Stella Creasy, I'm right in saying you got a 10% pay rise in 2015.
Yes, and I opposed it, and I have donated it towards the cost in my office of having more casework staff to be able to respond to the need within my local community, because I won't have unpaid employees.
Okay. Lynn Fox?
I think that if we're going to ask the public sector to continue with pay restraint, we will have to do the same. I don't think there will be an option. We had that correction way back in 2015. I think that the public found that hard to swallow. Yes, I did, like most MPs. And I think that having done that, if we've got that correction and we are going to have to impose continued restraint on the public sector, we will have to lead by example on that.
But would you like to see the pay cap ended?
Well, I think that we need to look at the control of public finances in a whole. We have a balance here to strike between our duty to remunerate those who work in the public sector and also to look after the interests of the taxpayers who pay those wages for those in the public sector. And I think that we've got a number of public peer review bodies coming forward. That's the appropriate place to look at that. But we need to remember that when we're talking about our public spending, we are spending as a country £46 billion this year in debt interest, for which we get nothing at all. And that's because of the debts we've run up in the past and the interest that's accrued on those debts. And we've got to get to a point where we stop doing that. And what people call austerity is actually living within your means. And we all have to understand that we're living
Okay,
within
but Liam Fox, hang on a second. You know the pressure there is.
We do know the pressure.
On the 1% pay cap. You opposed it when Labour put up. Are you saying there will not be any change and there should not be any change in that policy?
No,
or are you saying wait for the budget and maybe the Chancellor will
The Chancellor has made clear that we will look at the pay review bodies for the groups such as the nurses that we will look at and have always looked at as a special case. But the idea that the country can spend money that it doesn't have and simply leave the debt to the next generation is simply not acceptable. We've got to get out of those bad habits.
I have to say, sorry, just 1 moment. This is high hypocrisy indeed from the man who submitted an expenses claim for 3 pence for driving 100 metres. The man, and frankly, I'm surprised to see you sitting there tonight. I thought your best friend Adam Werrity might actually replace you. And I just think it's outrageous that you can sit here with a straight face and tell these people, talking these terms about austerity and restraint and living within our means, when you were quite happy to subordinate those to your own interests.
Liam.
But I just say that, you know, we're here to have a debate. If you want to get into smear, which is what you're very good at. But I think people here would like to have a real. I think people would like to have a real debate about the real issues. Thank you.
Because I would like to debate with Liam, because you're talking, Liam, like you haven't been in government responsible for our economy for the last 7 years, and you're talking like your government doesn't have issues. I agree with you. I want to get the debt down because every pound of interest we're paying is money we're paying to bankers rather than putting into public services. That's why I'm frustrated when I see your government wasting money on things like the bedroom tax, which cost more than it saves, on things like the contract for the DWP and the personal interpayment payments, where you've wasted £200 million.
And we got the deficit down by three quarters.
And when did you...
By 3/4.
Your government has promised every single year to end the deficit. If your government was the financial manager of a company, you'd have sacked them by now.
I'm going to go to members of the audience. The woman on the gangway there. The woman on the gangway there, yes.
Yeah.
You, ma'am.
You talk about the next generation. You know, there won't be any midwives around in the NHS if you don't value them, because we're all leaving. You know, we are fed up with it. I haven't had pay rise for 7 years, and I'm very experienced.
I'd be really interested.
Sorry, wait a minute, Stella. Sorry, are you saying you're leaving, or you say we're all leaving?
No, well, we're leaving in droves. Yeah. And you talk about the pay review body. The pay review body reports that 80% of the midwives that left the profession would have stayed if they were valued more highly.
Let's hear a bit more from our audience. The woman in green there at the back.
Well, I personally would want to pay more tax so that our firefighters, paramedics, anyone in public service, I value the education I have, the education my grandchildren will be getting, and I value my family having a hospital bed. So I don't understand why it's all about money. I would gladly give more tax.
OK. The man in the check shirt, the young man in the check shirt in the middle in the third row there. Yes, you.
I think going back to MPs' pay, I don't think a lot of people realise just how important all MPs' jobs are.
OK, Nick Ferrari.
Yeah, David's initial question was, should the MPs have a pay restraint? And of course they should. There's no question about it. And what I find truly extraordinary is that I heard a figure that, and bear in mind, these nurses and firefighters and others, their pay has been capped for 7 years. And it's a possibility that it might be capped for another 7 years. Now, the last time I looked, when I went to Sainsbury's or Tesco or Waitrose, the prices haven't been capped for 7 years, nor of your rents, nor of your mortgages, nor of your children's shoes. And what is amazing is not just the 1 billion or 1.5 billion that we've debated to deal with the DUP. There are so many other things on which this government wastes, and previous governments, extraordinary amounts of money. For instance, I'll just say the foreign aid budget, which I find quite incredible, £17 billion. But one other thing, which is a £56 billion white elephant called HS2, which is where we all need better broadband. And I understand that Hastings is an area that doesn't have the greatest rail service, so possibly I'm playing to a home audience there.
All right. The man in blue with spectacles on in the middle there, you say, yes.
Hello, I appreciate we're living through a time of great austerity, but I am very concerned about recent changes to the benefit system. I'll tell you, I was made redundant a year ago. I want to work very much. I've had 19 job interviews in a year, all unsuccessful. But a recent change to the benefit system means you now have to be unemployed for 9 months or 39 weeks before you get any help at all with your mortgage. I'm close to losing my home because of this. And what do the panel think about it?
Zanny Mintavelis, let's go back to the main question.
I think the audience are all raising incredibly important points, which lead into what I think we should be doing and need to have as a country is a very serious conversation about what kind of public services we want, what we want to be paying people in the public sector, what that means in terms of spending, and how we are going to raise the tax revenue to pay for it. And just a few facts. We still have, and Dr. Fox is right, we still have a pretty big budget deficit. It's not like we are spending far more than we are bringing in. We're about to, because of Brexit, I'm afraid, have a hit on our economy, which will mean less tax revenue. People are going to be poorer, and therefore there will be less tax revenue. It's perfectly reasonable that we may want to spend more on public services, but we're starting from a pretty weak position. So if we want to spend more, we need to raise more tax revenue. And Jeremy Corbyn, I'm afraid, is wrong to think that all of that tax revenue can come from corporations or the very rich. We have to have a proper, serious, grown-up conversation, as the lady in the back row said, about how much tax we as a society want to pay and what kind of public services we want. And those two have to balance.
All right. I want to move on to... You mentioned Brexit, and I want to move on to Brexit, which we have many more questions about than anything. But just before I do, Question Time is going to be in Burton-upon-Trent next week. That's the last programme of the summer. We're going to be back in September. But if you want to come to Burton-upon-Trent, there is the address to apply. I'll give it again at the end. Andy Thompson, let's have your question, please.
Why have 101 MPs this evening again gone against the will of the British people by voting to remain in the single market and the customs union?
Yeah.
Well, Stella Creasy was one of them. There were 100, 50, I think, Labour and 50 other parties voting against, voting in favour of remaining in the single market. So what's up? What's the game?
Let me be very clear. Right, we are leaving the European Union. The question now is, what is the best deal for Britain? And I voted against the Article 50 legislation. I voted tonight to make a point about the importance of having single market membership as part of the negotiations for exactly the points that Zanny is talking about, because the economic and social cost of these things is going to be horrific. And we need some honesty here about the choices that this country faces. And I worry about a government that, before it's even begun the negotiations, takes things off the table. So I want all of these options on the table. 650,000 jobs in London alone are dependent on the single market. If we want a Brexit that is going to work for this country, we have to decide what we think is important. And I think people's livelihoods and being able to keep a roof above their head, know there's a job and a job for them and their kids, is something we should prioritise.
How do you leave the EU and remain in the customs union and the single market?
101 different combinations that could happen. There are lots of countries that... Yeah, sorry, well, there are. And actually, one of the things that's frustrating about this debate for the last 9 months is you've had Brexit means breakfast means Brexit. There are 101 different deals. Different countries are part of the European Free Trade Association. Other countries are part of the EEA. There are countries that are part of the Customs Union. The Prime Minister said that she would like to be an associate member of the Customs Union. It's a membership that doesn't even exist yet. At the moment, this government is asking for a moon on a stick, and I want this country to be able to have some serious options to choose from, because the reality is we won't get everything. Now, I know that is going to be a difficult message for people, but I think you want politicians who are acting in what they think is the best national interest.
Right.
None of this is about repeating the referendum or undermining it. It's about saying what is in our best interest in the country, and I think that's the first thing you elect politicians to do.
So, Liam Fox, 101 different combinations. Did you think that Stella Creasy and others were going against the will of the British people by voting to stay in the single market?
Let's face it, the people who say we want to stay in the single market, want to stay in the customs union, but we really will still respect the will of the British people, it's not true. They've tried to frustrate the will of the British people. The British people made very clear in the referendum, and then in the general election, incidentally, the Labour Party manifesto said we will leave the single market. The Conservative Party said we will leave the single market. 82% of voters voted for one of those parties that's going to leave the single market. And I would say to those, who are intent on thwarting what the British public voted for in the referendum. We voted to have control of our own laws, control of our borders and control of our money. That means not being under the influence of the European Court of Justice, not having complete free movement as we have inside the single market. You know, what don't you understand about democratic, referendum or binary? Because that's what we voted for.
Liam.
All right, briefly, Stella, briefly, answer that.
That's not actually true about the Labour manifesto, but also we've just had a general election. Your government asked for a thumping mandate for that approach, for that hard Brexit, come what may, isolationist approach, and the public said no.
But hang on a second. If you're right about this issue, why did your party leader sack 4 shadow ministers tonight? Because they voted with you.
No, that's absolutely right. I'm not going to pretend that there's not a debate going on in the Labour movement.
A debate?
Yes. Well, sorry, do you want...
It's a polite way of putting it.
It is a shambles.
Actually, there are plenty on your side, Liam, who agree with us that the government should be asking about all options, that you don't go into negotiation writing off 2/3 of things.
Not one Conservative joined you tonight. Not a single Conservative
Liam,
voted
have
with
some
you tonight.
honesty with this audience. There are Conservatives who also agree that single market membership should be something that is part of the discussions. It doesn't mean it will happen, but it does mean it's part of the discussions. Why are you cutting off our nose to spite our face?
All right, let's bring in other members of the panel and the audience.
There seems to be, both from you, Liam, and from the audience, somewhat of a rewriting of history. As far as I remember, the referendum was about, did we want to leave the EU? It was not, did we want to leave the single market? Did we want to leave the customs union? And it so happens... It's been interpreted in the past year to be Brexit means a hard Brexit. And Stella's absolutely right that the results of the election were not a thumping majority for this. And you can say not, but there's not. If you look at opinion polls now, opinion polls seem to suggest that a majority of the British people actually want to stay in the customs union.
All right, okay, listen. Better if some of you
Sunday opinion polls.
Better if some of you speak than all of you shout. Who disagrees with what Zania's just said? All right, let's hear from you, the woman there on the right. Yes. What did you vote for when you voted?
Conservative. I didn't vote most recently because I didn't think it was worth doing.
No, I was thinking. All right.
But hundreds of years, this country has stood on its own. It's been the best in the world for almost everything. And we've joined up with others, and it's a load of rubbish. Everything we do is awful. We're in debt. It's all horrible. We should be back where we were on our own. That's the way.
Thank you. And anybody else want to take issue with what she said? You, sir, the man in green there. Yes.
I think there's a little addressed issue in society that there's this balance between freedom and responsibility. And there's not only left and right in the world, obviously, because Brexit proved that. It was split down party lines. But there is this issue that people want to be freer, and we voted by a slim majority, but we voted to be freer from the supranational system of the EU. And yes, it's a risk. Anyone saying it's going to be terrible if we stay or great if we stay, terrible if we leave or great if we leave.
But what about the 101 different combinations that Stella Creasy says are available? Do you think there are 101?
There are lots of options available.
And they should be available within the referendum of last year?
No, we can't all vote on 101 different things.
No,
That's
indeed,
what the government's
no, I mean,
for. We delegate that to them.
Nice for some of us, but hell for most of us. You sir there on the corner there. You.
Stella says that 650,000 jobs in London depend on the EU. They're not going to go away just because we leave. And you say that we want to be isolationist. The share of the world GDP that the EU has is going down year by year by year. We want to look to the rest of the world. There's a big world out there which we can be part of.
And what do you think of the remaining in the single market or remaining in the customs union?
I think we should come out, both of them.
Nick Ferrari.
Just before we move on, to the gentleman there who's tried 19 times, I wish you the very best of luck, and I hope somebody's watching tonight that gives you a go. The very best of luck to you, sir.
Who are you pointing at?
That gentleman there who says he's lost his job and he's tried 19 jobs. And by the way, I will write you a reference. I've known you for 20 years, and you're the finest guy I've ever come across. Not really, but I'll help. This is the reality. This is the reality of the situation. Would it be a good idea to perhaps pay some cash so we could get back into the single market? Yeah, possibly. But it is never going to happen. We are where we are. We might not be where we want to be. And to bring up the point from the young man sitting over here, he's absolutely right. It is a big, brave, bold world out there. And I ask you in all honesty, as you look at the European Union at the moment, as you see where Greece is, as you see where Italy's economy is, as you see where unemployment is in Spain and in Portugal, actually, would you want to now tie yourselves to something like that, which is past its prime and possibly like the old Soviet Union? And I suggest you wouldn't. And just finally, much as I respect Liam and I respect the whole front row, the rugby front row of our negotiators, Boris Johnson, David Davis and Liam Fox, I can't help but thinking the person who should be doing the negotiations is Arlene Foster, because, by God, she got a good deal out of that lot.
Terry Ann Mendoza.
I think the audience have raised really good points. In fact, Paul Mason, journalist Paul Mason, wrote an incredible piece prior to the EU referendum, which was about the absence of how, and the fact that you could even have a referendum where people who were never going to be responsible for delivering that Brexit, all that Remain, were allowed to make whatever the hell kind of promises they felt like on the day in order to get their victory, and never have to... And never have to take accountability for the result. And I think there's a real case now, actually, for, you know, we've got Brexit people in the audience and on the panel, and your main argument about Brexit and the fact that we should go ahead is that we had to have the democratic mandate. It's the will of the British people. I agree with you, which is why I think there is a legitimate case for saying that when the Brexit deal comes back, we hold a referendum on how.
OK. You sir at the front.
If, as our panel are saying, our MPs really have got the best interests of Britain at heart rather than self-interest, then after the British people have had the opportunity to vote us in or out on Brexit, there should be a cross-party project for the good of the nation to come together so that then we push the country forward.
I'll come to you up there. Now, hold on a second, then. Liam Fox, you are the man in waiting, in charge of negotiating deals with the rest of the world, as I understand it, once the main leaving the EU deal is completed. So presumably you're slightly sort of hanging around. I mean, have you done any deals yet? Not quite. No, but the point is this...
To answer your point,
you have.
We have actually got a lot of work to do to prepare to leave the European Union in terms of the agreements that we're party to as part of the European Union. We have to turn them into agreements for the United Kingdom outside. And the reason it's important, 90% of global growth in the next 10 years will be outside Europe. If we as a country... If we as a country want to generate the wealth that we will need for all those things that everybody wants in terms of spending on public services, that growth is going to come from somewhere else. We need to access and get into those markets outside the European Union. That's where growth is going to come. We need to be part of that.
What is... Sorry, let me just put a question. I want to put a question. Hang on a second, Stella. Hang on a second. Are there any circumstances in which remaining in the single market or the customs union question that Anne Thompson asked, would appeal to you, you would find it a sensible course? Or is Brexit means Brexit something that means something
If we
to you?
stay in the single market, we'll still be subjected to the European Court and we'll still be subjected to the free movement of people, which I think the electorate didn't want. If we stay in the customs union, we cannot negotiate our own trade agreements because we'll be bound by the European, what's called the Common External Tariff, and we will not be able to reduce the duties on developing countries who want to sell their goods to the United Kingdom because we'll be bound by that. We have both an economic and a moral mission to be able to make the best of the decision the British people have given us, and that opportunity is taking advantages of those big markets that are out there for our future prosperity.
Stella
it's a
Creasy,
great challenge.
Stella
We should rise
Creasy.
to it.
Zanny seems more important.
I just want to, I think this is all great rhetoric, but can I just add a little bit of reality to this great, brave new world that we're going to conquer? Yes, there are economies that are growing faster outside Europe, but 61% of Britain's trade is either with the European Union or with countries that already have a free trade deal with the European Union. No.
Who was saying it shouldn't be?
You
were saying it. You said your bit. It's all right. You've said your bit.
61% of our trade is with either the European Union or with countries with which the European Union already has a free trade, so we already have free trade with those countries. The rest of it is divided half to the United States and half other countries. Now, the United States, we might be able to get a free trade deal, but tariffs are already incredibly low. What the US would want is access to our agricultural markets. What we would want is greater access for services. Now, I'm a free trader. I think more free trade is great, but let's be realistic about what that means. That means the British people having hormone beef, having chlorine-washed chicken. Yes, it does, because that's what the Americans will want. And the idea that the other thing, Liam, is that, as you know well, the Americans are not going to negotiate with you until they know what the relationship is that you have with the rest of the European Union. And ditto with all the other big emerging economies. And just one fact. If the trade with the EU decreases by 5%, you need to increase trade with the 10 biggest Commonwealth economies by more than 30%.
So how would you?
So a tiny decline in our trade.
How would you go along with the decision that was made by the referendum in the first place?
If you want a Brexit,
can you put your hand on your heart and say, staying in the customs union, staying in the single market, accords with the wishes of the 52% of the British people?
Yes, because they wanted to leave the European Union. And yes, you will demand change. There will have to be changes to the way that Britain has its relationship with the European Union. I accept that, and so does everybody, but it's a negotiation that should not exclude the most sensible approach, which is to have all, as Stella says, all options on the table.
We have to leave. We've been told to leave by the people. They've given us instruction, not a request.
Right.
And if we stay in the single market and we stay in the customs union, we're still going to be in the European Union to all intents and purposes. That is not what we were instructed to do.
Let's hear from some more. Stella, I'll come to you because you asked her to go instead of you, but I'll come back to you in a moment. The woman up there, the second row from the back, yes.
I would trust what Zanny says because she works for The Economist. She knows money, so I think we should listen to her.
And the woman here in the front. You in the front.
Thank you. We are close to Europe. There is 300 million people. How are we going to, with the rest of the world? Australia has a population of about 23 million, Norway about 5 million, Canada 40-odd million. And, you know, someone said, oh, well, India's got a huge population, but there aren't that many rich people in India. Why would we reject the 300 million people who are on our doorstep?
This is simply, we're not rejecting. We're not rejecting Europe. We will want to trade with Europe. We want an open and liberal trading arrangement with the European Union, which we believe will be in both our interests. But there are some very, very big markets out there that we will be able to take advantage of. And as for the US will not talk to us, I've got news for you that we are beginning our actual discussions on the 24th of July next month.
Okay. A brief last word. I want to go on. We've got many other questions, not just Brexit. Yes.
This debate proves why actually you want more parliamentary scrutiny, because there are lots of different combinations. Liam isn't levelling with you. Whoever we trade with, we're going to have to abide by their regulations. That's the point of a trade deal. So you need to know what the options are. And what I want, and the others who are concerned about just walking away from single market membership, because it's not just about the tariffs, it's also about the standards. It's about things like your employment rights. It's about environmental standards that have been built up. We can look at what the deal is without in any way compromising that commitment that the referendum has had. Believe me, sir, I do not want to run the referendum again. But I do want what's in the best interest of this country. And I want the British public to know that politicians have done a proper job of scrutinising what the options are so that we've got you the best deal. I can't hand on heart tell you that's what's happened now.
OK. I'm going to take another question. Keith Piggott, please. Keith Piggott.
The horror of Grenfell Tower became politicised during the PM's question time. Do the panel think Parliament should adopt Mrs May's collective guilt approach to resolve, or Mr Corbyn's austerity point scoring?
OK, well, there was as you know, there was a division of opinion on in the House of Commons. Nick Ferrari.
I thought that was one of the lowest moments in Prime Minister's questions I've seen for some time. There are people now, even as we speak, who don't know where their loved ones are, who don't know where their families are. There are incredibly diligent men and women wading through, and I apologise, this is a graphic image, but it was reported in the papers today, up to 3 feet of broken appliances, ash and goodness knows what else. To see the leader of a political party try and score a cheap point over that, I thought was absolutely reprehensible, beaten only by your Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell suggesting both irresponsibly and utterly incorrectly, and it could be actually illegally, because it could now prejudice a future trial, that they were murdered by political decisions. There is a time for able politicians such as Stella and Liam and all their colleagues to debate this. But while those brave men and women are still searching for fragments of bone or teeth for those people, it is not the time to get political about it.
You at the back there.
What I think is more reprehensible than your point is that it's taken a tragedy like Grenfell Tower to even raise the issue. No one was speaking about it before, were they? So why shouldn't Jeremy Corbyn bring it up in a political context?
Because there will be a time to answer you, sir, and I hope that this will be the sea change moment that the Hillsborough tragedy was for how football stadiums were run, the Zeebrugge tragedy was for how roll-on, roll-off ferries were run, the King's Cross. I hope this is the sea change moment, I really do. But there are no party political points to score here, because without, and I don't want to even do this, but just very briefly, you can see that you can track some of the legislation back to Tony Blair. You can see that you can track some of the legislation back to the coalition government. No one party emerges with any damn credit here, so they should not be playing this game.
All right. Kellyanne Mendoza.
Do you know what I think is reprehensible? I think it's reprehensible and I think it's disgusting that the reason that that building was wrapped in combustible cladding was because the poverty of the people living in that tower block was offensive enough to hide behind combustible cladding and not offensive enough to deal with. I make no apology for saying it.
Well, if it's wrong, you have to, actually.
This is not about party politics. This is about, what it is about is saying there were a chain of events that led to this fire that have to be analysed, and those questions have to be asked. They have to be asked and answered openly. And it's not me saying that. It's not Jeremy Corbyn saying that. It's the survivors of this disaster. It's the residents of that tower wrote in 2014 saying, we believe this is a fire risk. They wrote in March of this year. In March of this year, they said it will take a catastrophic event for our concerns to be listened to. And tragically, that proved true because those people, because they were poor, Because they were immigrants.
No,
because
no, you cannot
they were
say that.
ignored. Because I guarantee you, Nick, if they would have been the richer residents of Kensington and Chelsea making those complaints, they would have been
There is
dealt
a
with.
football stadium
There
where
is-
Premier League footballers who are earning £300,000 a week, they play where there's this cladding. There are hotels, I won't name them, where there is this cladding and you're paying
Yeah,
£200 a
and
night.
we now know
You
that-
have
we
to
now
let
know
the
that-
inquiry take its course. You must.
The woman over there. I'll come to you. The woman there. Yes.
In 2009, 6 people were killed in a tower block fire in Southwark. The coroner said in 2013 that the cladding was to blame, and he said that all tower blocks should be retrofitted with sprinklers. This government did not provide the resources. They sent a letter. They didn't make it compulsory. They had the choice. David Cameron instead had a bonfire of building regulations, and he boasted of that.
Liam Fox.
Like a lot of people who've worked for the emergency services, this fire actually brought back a lot of unpleasant memories for me. I was a junior doctor. There was a fire, you may remember, David, the so-called ice cream wars in Glasgow. People were holding their children by the arms outside a barricaded flat block where people died in that. And for me, it brought back some really unpleasant memories of that. And I think that, do you know what? There will be a time to ask a lot of these questions. But there's still, there's still a great deal of suffering going on. People have had their lives ruined. People will have their families. They will never be together again. And I think that we need to conduct this debate with a little bit of respect for them. Politicising it, I think, is deeply tasteless and it's offensive.
I couldn't agree more, but I would say,
I think there's been a public policy failure here for decades. Yes. We're going to have to come to terms with that. And it's come at a lot of levels. It's come at government level, at legislative level, it's come at inspection level, it's come at building level, it's come at local authority level, and we'd be very wise now to let the inquiry take its course, stop pointing fingers, and remember that this is essentially still a dreadful, dreadful human tragedy that we're witnessing.
Hang on, Stella Creasy. What Jeremy Corbyn actually said in the House of Commons was that the fire was the result of disastrous effects of austerity, of a price paid in public safety, the terrible consequences of deregulation, cutting corners, which stem from a disregard, I quote him, for working class communities. Do you endorse that view?
So I'm very mindful tonight in my community in Walthamstow there are people in blocks that have cladding that is being investigated. So I agree with you that we have to choose our words carefully. I'm also very concerned by what we've seen from the judge today in the inquiry, who's already said, look, I don't think I can satisfy the concerns of the Grenfell residents in terms of what I'm going to be able to look at. Because what he's going to look at is when the fire happened and what happened after that. Absolutely, there is a time and place for those discussions. I think if one of the things that we've learnt from Hillsborough is when you're looking for both truth and accountability, transparency matters. And it does look like there is an increasing concern about building regulations. We don't know, Mum, which way it goes, but we do know that looking at whether or not our buildings regulations in this country have been applied, or they've been too flexible, or they haven't been enforced, is a question that needs to be answered.
So was your leader right to say that it was a disregard for working class communities and the disastrous effects of austerity that caused this fire? Right or wrong to say that in the House of Commons?
I don't agree with the way in which he put it. I do agree that the inquiry should look at a wider range of issues, and I think all of us, you can hear the heat in the audience tonight, you can hear the concern, and I understand where Jeremy was coming from in being concerned about this and being frustrated about it, because that's what you're talking about with the Larkinhall House Tower. But all of us have to channel our anger into what is the best thing for those people tonight who are worried about the cladding around them. And it is right that we have proper investigation. I'd also like to see the public advocate process fast-tracked, because one of the things we've also learned from Hillsborough is having the voices of the residents, the voices of the victims, front and centre. Why have they not been able to negotiate with the judge about his remit is a question for me. But because they haven't, the worry for all of us is that these questions won't get looked at. And I think all of us would agree we'd want a proper investigation, an independent investigation into what happens with those building regulations.
Zandy Minton-Meadows.
I think we have to have a proper investigation. We have to have one that is transparent, but that is also speedy, because part of the problem with public inquiries is that they can go on and on and on and on and on. So you don't want to have this done it is an incredibly emotional, understandably emotional issue. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy.
But do you understand it being politicised? Is it right that it should be a political issue?
No, I think Jeremy
between the
Corbyn was
parties?
utterly wrong to say that. I think it was both inaccurate and unhelpful, and more importantly unhelpful, because adding to the emotion at this point makes it less likely that we have the kind of speedy, transparent inquiry that we need to have. And it can happen. There was a terrible fire in Scotland not so many years ago in a tower. There was a quick analysis of what needed to happen with building regulations and their enforcement, and things changed and changed fast. We need that, but we also need to have, frankly, a broader look, and this is where I think the austerity here is it's not irrelevant, but it's somewhat tangential. But there is a broader problem with the housing stock in this country that this is partly a reflection of, and we need to have a debate on that. The inquiry isn't going to have that. The inquiry needs to look at building regulations and what caused the fire, how it spread, what can be done as quickly and to improve things as possible. But beyond that, we need a broader debate as a country.
Let me go back to the regulations isn't part of the inquiry at the moment, Zanny, and I think that's a concern that many of us have, is that ought to be something we are looking at now.
Keith Piggott, you asked the question. What do you make of it?
This is a collection of 600 Victorian cuttings of crinoline fire deaths. The first cutting says how to keep fire away from people and how to make non-flammable clothing. Lessons have been forgotten. They're never learned. They're just forgotten. And that's happened in this case for decades by all parties.
I'll take one point from you, sir, over there. Yes. There you.
What will be done to make sure that the government, whoever it may be, will listen to this public inquiry and make sure that they do the recommendation and it goes into legislation?
You think the inquiry may just be published and nothing happen?
Yeah, that could easily happen.
What do you think, Nick Ferrari?
I think that's a very relevant point from the gentleman up there, but sort of revisiting something I said. Tragically, every now and again, something comes along that just sears its way into our consciousness, such as Hillsborough. We've got to be careful what we say, because that's been a momentous week for that. Or the King's Cross fire, or the Townsend-Torreston ferry. And it causes massive change, because it is the will of the people, and the politicians know there has to be change. And I give you this promise, I'm telling you now, in 2 or 3 years' time, there won't be cladding on any of these hotels, on any of these hospitals, on any of these schools, on any of these apartment blocks, and Britain will be a bloody better place for it.
All right.
It's a very useful point.
End the critique of health and safety, because this government boasted about having a 1-in, 2-out approach to regulation, and if we're learning anything, actually regulations about building safety, about health and safety, are absolutely critical. So if one of the things that comes out of this is a recognition that health and safety is there exactly for those reasons.
All right. Liam Fox. Liam Fox, please.
You raised the point about legislation is very key. But you can legislate and you can have regulations all you like. You have to make sure they're implemented. And that is a key element. Politicians, we can pass laws, but if they're not being implemented on the ground, if there's not a mechanism to ensure that they're being implemented, then that is when tragedy can happen. And it's not just enough for us to say. It's not just enough to say.
Was that the part of the reason that enforcement isn't taking place is because of cuts to local government funding of 40%.
Okay.
Like really, like if you're not paying for the inspectors to enforce the legislation, what is the problem?
Use a brief point, you sir, and then we want to move on. The man there in the blue shirt. You.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to say that it's. We need to move from disgrace of the current situation to amazing grace. Let's take politics out of, social housing and boost our economy through social infrastructure and build more social housing. London is an absolute disgrace. Let's move it to amazing grace.
Okay. I'm going to go on. We've got a few minutes left, 8 or so minutes left. Dave Morrigan, let's have your question. Go.
Do the mainstream media still serve any useful purpose for the younger generation?
Well, We have the founder of the Canary, which is very much not mainstream media of the kind I think you're talking about. Newspapers and television?
Newspapers primarily, yes, but TV, radio...
All right. All right. Liam Fox, you start on this.
Well, frankly, I don't think you would be in the audience or we'd be on the panel if there was no purpose to the exchanges that we're having.
For younger voters?
For younger voters, for all voters.
Of which we have many.
For all voters, I think that we need to get as much public discourse as possible. Perhaps we need to look at the formats that we have in terms of whether they're interesting to young voters, whether we're creative enough in the way that we get the messages out. But, you know, the more we can get information, the more we can get people involved in the political process and public policy process, the better. I think we'd all agree on that. I think that the media does need to innovate, but the other thing that we require a free media for is a counterbalance to our political system. We need a media that is able to say things that politicians don't like. There needs to be an ability for people to express views we don't necessarily want to hear. That is how you keep a free and open society, and that hopefully is the legacy we would want to give to younger people.
All right. Kerry-Ann Mendoza, you founded the Canary, which is social media. I don't know why it's called social media, whatever you call it. Do mainstream media serve any useful purpose, or do young people, it's younger voters we're talking about, look to people like you for their information?
Yeah, I think I disagree with Liam's analysis about format. Format isn't the issue. The issue is a painful lack of diversity in our mainstream media. It's pitiful. And it's a lack of diversity that's on several levels. So first you have a lack of diversity in terms of ownership. 80% of our media is owned by 6 corporations. That's unacceptable. But that lack of diversity then permeates into the newsrooms. So the whole path into journalism these days is you basically go to a handful of universities, maybe 6, and then you do an unpaid internship, probably based in London, and that prejudices against... But Nick says rubbish. Absolutely. There was a study that came out yesterday. 51% of our journalists were public school educated, compared to 7% of the population at large. So what you end up with is a mostly white, mostly male, mostly middle class media based mostly in London. And the problem with that is that narrow slice of humanity doesn't know what it doesn't know. And this isn't about people being evil or being cruel. It's just simply, it shouldn't be a controversial point to say that the newsrooms of the British media should look and sound like the modern Britain in which they sit. That should not be a controversial point.
Nick Ferrari.
Right. It will be an unpalatable fact for you, but the reality is that the people who are involved in the brutal racist killing of Stephen Lawrence would not be behind bars without the power of the Daily Mail, and that's a fact, and the editor took a great risk and could have gone to jail for that. The other thing is, of course, we talk about young people. Actually, I have been in and around the newspaper business for about 50 years. My late father ran a press agency. I have a television show, I'm on the radio, and I write a column for the Sunday Express, so I cover the whole damn lot. Never has the mainstream media been more important, because while I respect what people like that are doing, and it's great, and it gets kids involved, which is fantastic, don't forget that when you go to these sort of utterings, which at many times are like the mad ramblings of the man on the top deck of the bus speaking into his hand, they have no journalistic backup whatsoever, which is why we heard that the Pope was endorsing Donald Trump. So that is why we need to keep journalists like the people who work on this show on Question Time, who work on my radio show on LBC, because when you hear it from us, it will be true, or to the best of our endeavours, it will be true.
Like
not
Katie
just made
Hopkins,
up because I've had a can of Heineken and smoked a joint.
That is outrageous! Firstly, you want to talk about facts. Firstly, our readership isn't predominantly young. Our readership is predominantly 25 to 50.
I was addressing that man's question.
Secondly, our newsroom is not young. Our newsroom is diverse. We range from 20 through to our most veteran reporter was a journalist in traditional media before I was even born. We're diverse ethnically, we're diverse in terms of religion, Jewish, Muslim, Christian and atheist.
Didn't say you weren't.
And what we do, and the idea that you can work for a station that employed Katie Hopkins...
Right.
Just this week, a Muslim man was beaten to within an inch of his life.
I don't think Katie Hopkins was involved in that somehow.
And the people painted over his house Katie Hopkins' tweet. So when we're talking about journalistic responsibility, I think we need to look at the mainstream
media.
I'm going to hear from the woman
here. Yes, you. The woman here, please. Thank you.
As a younger voter, I think that you can bleat on about different types of media, but the media report what they see. And frankly, our politicians' behaviour is such a turn-off. Both sides are point-scoring cheaply, and we had the Conservatives jeering and cheering when they voted down the public sector freeze. And it's such a turn-off. They seem so out of touch.
What about the newspapers, though?
You can blame the different types of media for young voters not engaging. They can only report what they see. And actually, it's the behaviour of the politicians that turn us off. Yeah.
Zanny Minton-Meadows, as the editor of a long-established magazine.
Very long-established and independent, I may say. So utterly commercially independent.
Do mainstream media serve any useful purpose?
Yes, I think it does. I think all voices are important.
For younger voters.
Yes, I think actually there's a hunger for real news, for good analysis out there, as much among young people as older people. You have to reach people in the way that they want to consume their media. So we reach lots of people now through Facebook, through Twitter, through Snapchat, one of our biggest recent successes. You can't keep doing exactly the same as what you did, but the people really value authoritative, non-ideological, good analysis. And many voices is good. I welcome your voice. I welcome LBC. I think it's great to have lots of voices. I think in this country, and I spent most of my career outside of this country, it's interesting coming back how the press is dominated by a few publications. And I think there has been a sort of incredible power there. But that is now waning, because if you look at this election result, in some sense, it's a pretty damning indictment of the power of the Daily Mail and the Sun and so forth.
We haven't much time left. Stella Creasy, do you think it was social media that built up Labour support in this election?
Oh, look, 60% of people, I think 60% of people under 30 get their news from Facebook. Clearly, the way in which people are consuming news has changed. I think in a healthy democracy, you need both news and analysis, but you need to be able to tell the difference between both. And frankly, whether it's offline or online, I think you need to have confidence in the sources. So I agree that we need to look again. I mean, in this country, we've traditionally separated out broadcast from print. Our print media doesn't have the same impartiality. No, it doesn't. I think you would not say the Daily Mail was impartial.
No, but you don't have to buy it.
Stella Creasy.
But what I worry about, what I worry about is I do have younger people in my community coming to me who are very, very critical of official sources of information, but will then send me links from Russia Today and say that backs up their idea. And what I want us to be able to have is a debate about sources, because actually I think all of you should be open to the scrutiny about what is your evidence base for the claims that you're making. And I do think the news media model is changing.
OK, we've got to stop. We've got to stop, I think. Quick question to you. Daily Mail or the Canary?
To do what with?
To do what with? That's a fine answer. OK, very briefly, so the man who asked the question, I think we have 30 seconds left.
I'd just like to state that today, earlier on social media, I put this question out with particular focus to newspapers. I had about 20 of my friends respond. Not one of them, from the age of in their 20s through to their 50s, ever buy a newspaper anymore. Okay. It's all through the internet and social media.
Thank you very much. Our time's up, I'm afraid. Next week, Question Time is going to be in Burton-upon-Trent. It's the last programme before the summer break. Parliament breaks too. We're back on September the 14th with a programme from Stratford in East London. Now, if you want to be in the audience there in Burton-upon-Trent, or Stratford, if you can remember it, on September the 14th, apply via our website. It's the best way, probably, or go online, ring us, on 0330 123 9988. If you've been listening to this on 5 Live, Question Time Extra Time follows, and that goes on until the early hours. But here we come to a close. My thanks to our panel, all our panellists, and to all of you who came to Hastings tonight to take part. Until next Thursday from Question Time, good night.
With Grothcup talks about news fatigue and Adam Bolton rounds up all that and Andrew Neil this week next.